Good afternoon. We are pleased to welcome you to the Washington Labs Academy webinar series. We hope you find the next hour or so useful and informative. We've developed our webinar series to deal with some of the technical and administrative issues our customers face on a day-to-day basis. And we recognize engineering challenges can be complex, and we're always looking for ways to support the technology industry. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping details. First of all, I hope everyone can see the title slide on their computer. A recording of the presentation is underway and will be sent to all attendees. A full screen view may be preferred. Your selection at your computer can be done using the menu panel. In the menu on your screen, go to View and then select Full Screen. We estimate the main bulk of the presentation will take about an hour. And we welcome your questions. You can submit them to us via email, info@wll.com. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Emma Bird is a multilingual project coordinator at Product Compliance Specialists with a main area of expertise in the Middle East Gulf states radio frequency device approvals. She is well acquainted with the product regimes with a concentration in Qatar and Saudi Arabia requirements. In addition, she focuses on India BIS safety approval schemes. And so without further ado, I am going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to you, Emma.
Great, thank you very much. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar on the Gulf member states. We'll first go through a brief overview of the membership and then move on to an introduction into the regulatory approval regimes in each of these countries. However, I'd first like to provide a brief introduction to Product Compliance Specialists. We are an in-house consultancy specializing in managing the certification of radio, telecommunications, and ITE products. We specialize in handling international projects and frequently manage projects for over 50 countries simultaneously. We also offer regulatory intelligence and regulatory consultancy services to assist manufacturers with products in the developmental stages. Since our inception, we have obtained over 30,500 type approval certificates in over 170 countries and territories. Our multilingual team is based both in the UK and in Shanghai, with 8 languages spoken between us. So I'd now like to begin and provide some context to this webinar. The Gulf Cooperation Council, otherwise known as the GCC, was first established in Saudi Arabia in 1981 and today is made up of 6 Middle Eastern countries. The aim of the GCC was to create a common political and economic platform for all member states. From a regulatory perspective, the GCC Standardization Organization, or GSO, was then established in 2001 by the GCC Supreme Council and began operation in 2004 in Saudi Arabia, where it is headquartered today. The GSO has developed several standards and has become more active in recent years. The most notable regulations in place today are the General Product Safety Regulation, the Low Voltage Electrical Appliances and Equipment Regulation, the Technical Regulation for Toys, and the regulation regarding the use of the G mark. As of today, there are almost 18,000 devices registered in the GSO database. It's worth noting that this database mostly consists of household appliances and toys, and the GSO conformity scheme and regulations themselves remain very much a work in progress. With this in mind, however, it remains the case that if any member state has their own specific national regulations and standards in place, then these would take precedence in said country. There are mandatory radio, telecom, and EMC and safety type approval requirements in all member states, and we'll now take a closer look at each. So first up, we have Bahrain. Bahrain is a sovereign state and an archipelago of 33 islands located between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. It has a modest population of around 1.6 million, the large majority of which are also internet users. There are 2 regulators in Bahrain covering RF, telecom, and ITE devices: the Directorate of Wireless Licensing, Frequency and Monitoring, and the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority. Each regulator has their own scope of devices that they are responsible for. For both regulators, a paperwork-only process can be followed. and for both, a local certificate holder is required. So starting with DWLF and M, this regulator is responsible for wireless devices containing Bluetooth, WLAN, or those operating as short-range devices, as well as satellite devices. The EU TCF and full set of RF, EMC and safety test reports are required. The certificate holder must be a local company, but it does not need to be the actual importer of the product. One certificate is sufficient for all importers to then use. The lead time is around 2 weeks, and the certificate is then valid for 3 years. A simplified process can be followed at renewal, and the EU TCF does not need to be resubmitted here. The TRA are responsible for cellular devices, ITE, and telecom equipment. It's important to note that if a device contains WLAN, Bluetooth, and cellular radio, then the type approval application must be submitted to the TRA only, as the cellular function will take precedence. As with DWLF&M, the certificate holder must be a local company, but does not need to be the actual importer. Again, the lead time is around 2 weeks, and the certificate is then valid for 3 years. A simplified process can be followed at renewal, and again, the EU TCF does not need to be resubmitted here. There are currently no labelling requirements for devices approved by the DWLF&M or TRA in Bahrain. So next up, we have Kuwait. So it's got a population of over 4 million inhabitants and borders on Iraq and Saudi Arabia. There are currently only national type approval requirements in place for radio devices, and a single regulator, the Communication and Information Technology Regulatory Authority, or CITRA, is the regulator in place here. The approval process is paperwork only. The CITRA only require basic technical documents and radio test reports, as well as the EU DOC. EMC and safety reports are not mandatory. Unlike Bahrain, the foreign manufacturer may act as the certificate holder. The lead time is approximately 4 weeks, and certificates are valid for 1 year. Although seemingly a straightforward process, it is highly advantageous to speak and write Arabic language, as CITRA are more responsive on the phone rather than via email. Again, there are currently no labelling requirements in place for Kuwait, although the regulator recommends to ensure that the CE mark is affixed to the product. So now moving on to Oman. The Sultanate of Oman has a population of around 4.8 million and borders the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The Telecommunications Regulatory Authority is responsible for all wireless telecom and ITE products. The process for approval is paperwork only, and a local holder is required. So as I mentioned, the TRA governs all radio, telecom and ITE devices. A full set of EU reports is required, and a local holder is also required. Although approvals can be issued to any local company, it is necessary that each importer is provided a permission from the original certificate holder to leverage the approval certificate. Without this, there is a risk that the product will not be released at customs. It's also highly recommended that the safety test reports are available for other products which do not require national type approval, such as power supplies. Although there are no regulations in place, customs can sometimes request to see copies of reports to release the goods. So, in order to avoid any delays and to help speed up the clearance process, it's recommended to have these to hand in case they are requested. Omani approvals are obtained within approximately 1 week and are valid indefinitely. Unlike the countries that we've looked at before, Oman does have some mandatory labelling requirements in place. The label format consists of the equipment type and its approval details, and then the details of the local dealer responsible for the product. The label must be affixed to the product itself, as well as either the packaging or user manual. In the event that the device is too small to have the label affixed, it is acceptable to affix the label to the packaging itself. Labelling is also voluntary, only in a few cases, such as automotive applications, which are already fitted onto the vehicle before import, modules and interface cards already fitted into their housing before import, and all access and core network equipment imported for installation in the public licensed telecom networks. So next up, we will take a look at Qatar. Qatar lies across the Persian Gulf Sea from Bahrain and borders Saudi Arabia. It has a population of approximately 2.7 million inhabitants and almost just as many internet users. Both RF and telecom devices require type approval in Qatar, which is regulated by the Communications Regulatory Authority, or the CRA. There are two routes to approval depending on the test lab that has carried out the testing, or whether the device has already undergone an assessment by a recognised body. The full criteria can be found in CRA's type approval guidelines. As with other member states, a paperwork-only process can be followed, and the applicant for approval can be the foreign manufacturer. Depending on the route that is followed, typical documents required are the EU test reports, EU DOC, and the EU type examination certificate. If the device is UHF RFID or WLAN, then a frequency declaration confirming the device will operate as per national requirements will also be needed. For 5 GHz WLAN, the permitted output power in band 3 in Qatar is limited to 100 milliwatts EIRP versus 1 watt EIRP in the EU. For UHF RFID, Qatar will follow EU, but it is still necessary to formally declare the operating band and its output power. The lead time will vary depending on which approval route can be followed. I will explain a little more on this in the next slide. For both routes, the manufacturer can hold the approval, and once obtained, certificates are then valid indefinitely. The simplified approval route in Qatar can be followed if the device has already been approved by National Regulatory Authority or a Conformity Assessment Body, or a CAB, recognised by the authority. A full and detailed list can be found in the authority's type approval regulations. There is a long list of international test laboratories listed as a recognised CAB, and either a notified body in any of the EU member states or regulators from UAE, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are recognised NRAs. The standard process is then followed if the above criteria cannot be met. Again, as per other Gulf states, there's no need to worry about any labelling requirements, as this is not enforced in Qatar. So now moving on to Saudi Arabia, and a slightly more complicated country in terms of compliance schemes. Saudi Arabia has a population of over 30 million inhabitants and with over 40 million mobile subscriptions. It is the headquarters of the GSO and GCC, and it borders Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Yemen, Qatar, UAE and Oman. There are national requirements and standards in place for radio and telecom, ITE and electrical and electronic devices. Historically, this has always been divided up between the Communications and Information Technology Commission, otherwise known as the CITC, and the Saudi Standards Metrology and Quality Organization, otherwise known as SASO. For approval with either regulator, a paperwork-only process may be followed. However, as I will explain, samples can be required for testing for SASO. So first, looking at the CITC. Their scope covers devices which are classed as communications products. The CITC technical specifications mainly cover radio and telecom standards, but certain IT standards also feature. CITC follow EU standards, and so if your product is compliant to EU, then it will be compliant for Saudi Arabia too. A basic EU TCF is required, but it is important to note that EMC and safety reports are not mandatory. A signed EU DOC, as well as the test lab's certificate of conformity, is mandatory as well. Assuming no questions are raised during the review, certificates can be issued very quickly and are then valid for 1 year. Renewals can be obtained by a simplified route, and it's not necessary to resubmit the same documents. The difficulties encountered over the last couple of years are with regards to product scope and what the CITC are responsible for. The CITC now follow a much stricter criteria in defining a communications device. For example, a barcode scanner or mobile printer containing a radio will not be approved as it is not considered as a communications device. The way around this is to instead approve the radio module or chip that is integrated into the host device. The host itself would then be subject to SASO requirements. The SASO scheme has always been linked to import and so is typically handled at this stage versus the stages of obtaining product compliance certificates. Over the last couple of years, SASO has been in the process of implementing a new program to streamline the certification process of both in-scope and out-of-scope products. This program is called Saudi Product Safety Program, or SALIM, and the online portal that accompanies it is called SABRE. With the new SABRE portal and various new regulations, the Saudi Arabian requirements are in a state of flux, and the list of regulated products changes frequently. However, currently, regulated products include those with energy efficiency considerations, such as lighting products, fans, and domestic appliances, as well as other high-risk products, such as some IT products and toys. Non-regulated products include many non-electronic items, as well as some electronic items. Some of the non-regulated products are somewhat arbitrary at present. For example, some products containing radio modules are currently out of scope. Products will need to be checked on a case-by-case basis to determine their regulatory status. As a general overview, CB or ILAC accredited reports will be needed, and the exporter must act as the applicant. I will provide some more detail on this in the next slide. The lead time is approximately 2 weeks, and validity will depend on the final certificate received. The challenge that manufacturers currently face is the list of regulated products and the route to follow, as this is subject to change. The application process will depend on whether the products within a shipment are regulated or not. For a shipment of entirely non-regulated products, no testing is required and no product certificate of conformity is required. The applicant and the importer will often need to sign a DOC, and a desktop review will be undertaken on the shipment documentation. The shipment certificate of conformity will then be issued. For regulated products, however, an electrical safety test report will be required. Reports from ILAC accredited labs are accepted. The local importer must be registered with SABRE and have an account on the portal in order to issue a product certificate of conformity for each regulated item. A shipment certificate of conformity will still be required for the overall shipment as well. For products with energy efficiency requirements, CB safety testing will be required, as well as testing to the relevant SASO EER standard. Access to SABRE will be required again, and a special SASO IECEE certificate will be issued. A shipment certificate of conformity will still be required for the overall shipment. In terms of labelling, there are no specific labelling requirements in place. However, 3G and 4G handsets and related equipment, like cellular phones and tablets, both consumer and commercial, require an E-label showing the type approval number. The CITC are likely to request to see this label for their approval of how this is done. So now moving on to UAE. With a population of almost 10 million inhabitants, UAE is a very attractive market. There are 2 key regulators with regulatory requirements covering radio, telecom, ICE, and electrical and electronic devices. These regulators are the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority and the Emirates Authority for Standardization and Metrology. The TRA are the regulator for wireless and telecom devices and leverage EU reports for most reviews. That being said, they do reserve the right to request a sample for inspection or testing and will always request samples for local testing of any cellular device. The local holder, otherwise known as the dealer, can be a local or foreign entity as long as they are registered with the TRA and have a valid dealer certificate in place. Dealer registrations can be obtained directly from the TRA and are valid for 5 years. The lead time to approval is anything from 1 to 5 weeks, depending on the product type and whether a paperwork or testing route has been followed. Once obtained, certificates are then valid for 3 years and are renewed via a simplified process. The RoHS scheme came into effect in January 2018 and effectively mirrors the EU directive and requirements. There are 2 routes to compliance, both requiring local representation and both at the manufacturer's discretion. The Emirates Conformity Assessment Scheme, or ECAS, involves product testing at an accredited lab or a critical component assessment. The accredited lab can be from outside of the UAE. ECAS reviews can typically take around 1 month. Certificates are issued per factory and per brand and are valid for 1 year. The renewal process is as per the original process. The Emirates Quality Mark Scheme, or EQM, is a quality management scheme involving factory inspections. For this reason, lead times can vary. Multiple factories and brands can be issued on a single certificate and are valid for 3 years. Renewals are maintained via annual audits. So the LVD scheme is also governed by the ESMA and is applicable to all regulated equipment within the range of 50 to 1000 VAC and 75 to 1500 VDC unless specifically exempted. As per the RoHS scheme, there are 2 routes to compliance, again, both requiring local representation and both at the manufacturer's discretion. ECAS, which takes only 2 to 4 weeks, or ECAS and EQM, which obviously takes a lot longer. The ECAS scheme is the preferred route here, as no local testing is required and no factory inspection is required either, and so this is what we have provided some further details on. A valid IECEE CB test report and certificate to relevant safety standard and an Arabic language user guide are required for ECAS LVD applications. ECAS allow a maximum of 4 test reports for each application and allow up to 45 models of the same type to be included in one single application. It's important to note that only 1 product category is permitted for a single application. Once obtained, certificates are then valid for 1 year and renewals are as per the original process. Unlike other Gulf countries, UAE also has labelling requirements for all schemes. The TRA label is made up of the registered dealer number and approval number and can be affixed to the product or user manual and packaging. E-labelling is only permitted for mobile phones. It's also important to note that local retailers have an obligation to place a declaration of conformity card on the product display platform. This consists of the approval and model details and a QR code which essentially displays the same information. For RoHS and LVD via ESMA, there are also labelling requirements depending on the route used. The ECAS mark is mandatory when this scheme is followed and must be affixed to the product itself. Alternative labelling methods can be approved by ESMA. The EQM mark is voluntary only. However, as it is regarded as a higher quality mark than ECAS, it would be advantageous to ensure that this is displayed if the EQM route has been followed. So that now takes us to the end of this webinar, and we'd now like to move on to a quick question and answer session.
Okay. Thanks, Emma. We do have a few questions to ask you here. So the first couple regarding Saudi Arabia. How can a manufacturer determine whether their device will fall under the scope and require the CITC approval?
That's a really good question. So while the CITC state that their scope covers communication devices, this is always subject to interpretation of the specific CITC reviewer who ends up handling the application, and their scope is not well defined. The best approach that PCS would recommend is to apply for CITC approval and then await their final decision on the application. This can be either approved, rejected, or not under CITC authorization.
So for rejected, if the CITC rejects the application, can you reapply?
Yes, yeah. So it is possible to reapply for a model which has been rejected by the CITC. However, if the final decision on an application is not under CITC authorization, it's not possible to overturn this decision, nor can you then reapply for approval of this model.
Okay. So if a device has been approved in one Gulf country, is it possible to leverage this approval in another Gulf country?
Again, another good question, but sadly, no, this is not possible. So holding an approval in one Gulf country does not mean that a device is guaranteed to obtain approval in another. However, it is worth noting that if a model has been approved in one of the Gulf countries already, a simplified process, as I mentioned, can then be followed in Qatar to obtain approval.
Okay. So are family approvals permitted in Bahrain?
So no, family approvals are not permitted in Bahrain. Each model needs to obtain its own approval certificate, even if it shares documentation with other models. It's also worth noting here that Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, none of those countries allow family approvals either.
Wow. Okay. So one last question. What are the main reasons for delays in the Gulf states when you're doing approval?
So like so many other countries that we handle here at PCS, it's important for us to be aware of national holidays. So in the case of Gulf countries, the holidays include Ramadan and Eid, and authorities are often closed for longer periods of time, or they work reduced hours. So this can then often lead to a backlog in work at authorities. As well as any delays, it's also worth bearing in mind here that the working week in Gulf countries is different to Western countries. So their week begins on a Sunday and ends on a Thursday.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay. Well, Emma, I thank you very much for taking time out today to enlighten everyone about the compliance process in the Gulf states.
No problem at all. My pleasure.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the event. On the behalf of Washington Labs Academy, I want to thank everyone for their attendance. A reminder, if you have any questions about the material that was covered in our webinar today, please feel free to send us an email, info@wll.com. And with that, I bid you a good rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.